Alrighty, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webcast, how to integrate risk management throughout the life cycle of a medical device in the coming decade, presented by John Spear, founder and vice president of quality assurance and regulatory affairs at Greenlight Guru. Before we get started, I have a few items I want to go over just to orient you guys on how to use the interface for today's program. So if you're not familiar with this, we'll just go through this real quickly. You're listening in on your computer audio by default, but if you want to call in on your phone, if you go to the audio panel there on the right-hand side and click on phone call, the audio call-in information will be displayed there for you if you want to dial in. Also, you'll have the opportunity to submit questions via text today to our presenter, John. To do so, it's down at the bottom of this panel here. You'll see the questions panel. Just go ahead and enter the question there in that enter question for staff area. And we'll be reading those questions aloud towards the end of the presentation today. So now I'd like to formally introduce John Spear. John is a medical device industry veteran with over 20 years of experience in a variety of roles, including product development, project management, quality, and regulatory. He's helped dozens of devices get to market over his career and is a thought leader, speaker, and regular contributor to numerous leading industry publications. John Spear is the founder and vice president of quality assurance and regulatory affairs at Greenlight Guru, the main contributing author of the publication, and also the host of the #1 most downloaded podcast in the industry, the Global Medical Device Podcast. Without further ado, I'll turn things over here to John to start the program.
Thank you, Alex. And Alex, just confirm before I start talking and you start getting a lot of questions, are you able to see my screen or do I need to share that now? Oh, here we go. All right.
Perfect.
All right, well, welcome everyone, and it's really a great honor to have this opportunity to speak with you all today. I know this topic of risk management is one that can be frustrating and create a lot of concern and challenges for medical device professionals. So hopefully there's something that I can share with you today to give you some insights how to make this a little bit smoother. As Alex shared, I've been in this industry over 22 years right now, and it's mostly been fun, and it's hard to believe it's been that long. Just a little bit more depth about my background. I've been in product development, I've been in quality, I've been in regulatory, started businesses, worked with a lot of different types of products. I've had the opportunity to bring over 40 products to market and implemented quality systems dozens and dozens of times, and put together regulatory submissions, 510Ks, PMAs, tech files, etc. And I've had also that opportunity to sit across the table from ISO auditors and FDA inspectors. So pretty good set of experiences, and very ingrained in risk management and what it means to us as medical device professionals. And of course, as Alex mentioned, please be sure to submit your questions today. And certainly if you think of something after today, you can see my contact information on screen. Feel free to send me an email. I read and will respond to every email that I get. Before I dive too deep into the presentation today, I thought I'd give you a little bit of background about Greenlight Guru. You probably have read some of our content or listened to some of our webinars and participate or had a chance to listen to the Global Medical Device Podcast. So thank you for all of that. Greenlight Guru is the only medical device quality management system on the market today. It is the only market we work in. It has been designed and developed by actual medical device professionals, so that is a unique distinction about us. But I would encourage you to go to G2 Crowd, see what our customers are saying, go to all these other sources of where content and information about Greenlight and our philosophy and approach to this is all about. A few topics that we'll dive into today on the bigger picture of risk management. We'll dive into some, certainly not all, but some of the current challenges that we're faced with respect to risk management. We'll talk a little bit about 14971 2019, and in case you haven't or didn't realize that the 14971 standard is the industry's standard for product risk management, and that was recently revised at the tail end of 2019. We'll talk about the importance of and the relationship really of risk management with the design and development process, and we'll also talk a little bit about risk-based approach to your quality management system I know that particular area gives folks a little bit of concern, especially when 1345 was updated in 2016 to talk about being risk-based approach with your quality management system and that sort of thing. So there's a little bit of confusion there. We'll dive into some of the details around that as well. So first up, let's talk about some of the current challenges in risk management. So Greenlight Guru, we did a kind of a state of the medical device industry survey last year. If you'd like a full report of that, send us a note. I think it's available for download on the Greenlight Guru website. You can access that by going to www.greenlight.guru. I'll share some of the insights throughout today's presentation, specifically as it relates to risk management. And first stop here is the top 5 challenges that we heard from you, the medical device community, with respect to managing risk. And the top challenge, if you will, is a lot of us are struggling during the design and development process to have enough details, information, etc., in order to properly assess the risk that our products pose. And we'll dive a little bit into some of the details around that here in a few moments. But I go back to the beginning of my career in the medical device industry way back in 1998, and my start in the medical device industry really predates any sort of quote formal risk management. I mean, at that time, 14971 did not really exist, and the regulations and the expectations from regulatory bodies with respect to risk was well, it's certainly not what it is today in 2020. It was more of an expected behavior as part of the design and development process, and even then, somewhat even today, frankly, the tool set that we were as med device professionals we were using were tools and approaches that maybe weren't the best tool set. And in my own experience, at least early on in my career, we started to do a lot of FMEA type approaches, failure modes, and effects analysis. But the challenge with that tool is your product has to be pretty well vetted. You generally have a pretty good idea of the parts, pieces, components, and et cetera that are going to go into your medical device. And doing an FMEA it's typically a fairly late stage activity during the design and development process. So I think hopefully you all are aware that we need to be doing a much better job of embracing risk management practices much earlier. Even at the point where you have an idea, these are the times where we should start doing that. But I think it becomes challenging as to what we need to do and how do we get the information and that sort of thing. Some of the other challenges, it's not clear who owns risk throughout the entire product lifecycle. I think it's pretty clear, generally speaking, that during the design and development process, generally the product development team will, quote, own that risk management activities during the design and development. But once you launch a product, then what happens? I think there's some confusion about that. The other challenge that we heard from you all that participated in this survey that we did is the feedback, loop. So once you launch your product and then you're in the market and you start getting feedback, from the manufacturing of your product or from customers, et cetera, that doesn't always feed back into that risk management process very well. It's confusing how to manage that. And, again, the expectation or the idea is risk management is a total product life cycle process. So if we don't have a good feedback loop, then we're going to struggle with that total product life cycle approach. And then another item we heard is consistent use of risk items across devices or teams. So a lot of times, and I've seen this in my career too, that the challenge is that a lot of times the team working on a particular product or device, we sort of create our own lexicon or terminology with respect to that device. We don't necessarily carry that across the entire organization, across all of the product portfolio, and so you get a lot of varying interpretations of things. So there's some challenges there. And then the fifth biggest challenge that we heard from the medical device industry is really just visibility and traceability and frankly access to risk management files throughout that entire product lifecycle. And I think part of this is I think it's indicative of the approach or the tools that we are using these days. I guess I'll be curious to hear your questions and comments later on today, but my suspicion is that a lot of you are still very reliant or dependent on spreadsheets to document a lot of your risk assessment activities, and that those spreadsheets are fairly static, especially once you launch your product. A lot of times what I've seen in practice is, like I said, during the design and development, I think teams are pretty good about keeping that spreadsheet, if you will, up to date and current throughout the entire design and development process. But once you go to market, a lot of times that spreadsheet gets archived and buried, and those folks that are managing and maintaining the product throughout the entire product lifecycle may not even know that exists or even have access to it. So there's some challenges there that are, I think the tools and the technology that we're not using create some bigger hurdles and obstacles and relate to some of those challenges that I shared a moment ago. This is part of why, Greenlight Guru, this is our mission, really, frankly, is to make sure that you and your teams have access to design control, risk management, all product information throughout the entire product lifecycle, and to make sure that this is a connected ecosystem, because that's really, really important. From the survey that we conducted, you can see that a lot of the industry is still using legacy tools, and I put things like spreadsheet in that legacy tool bucket, if you will. So we have a lot of room to grow, I think, as an industry. Whether you're using Greenlight or some other solution, my encouragement, my advice, my recommendation to you is to make sure that we're getting away from these legacy tools and starting to use more purpose-built solutions and workflows that meet the needs of a medical device professional, that align with the regulations and the requirements, specifically with respect to risk. Make sure you have a solution that's in place that meets the criteria defined in 14971. I think that's really, really important that we start to shape our practices around and implement tools around what's expected of us so that we can be more proactive and more thought-provoking with respect to risk and not let the spreadsheets and the formatting and the legacy tools that we may be using get in the way of the practice. Integrating risk management, what is that all about? I think there's a couple of different layers to integrating risk management. Certainly, as I mentioned off the jump, that 1345, when that was updated in 2016, they introduced this concept of a risk-based QMS. And there's several references actually made to the 14971 standard. And some of the challenges around that are making sure that your processes, your systems that you have, not just from a product perspective, but all of the things that you do with respect to your day-to-day life and all of your processes, that you want to make sure that you have a risk-based methodology and approach that you're implementing throughout that entire practices. So I think there's some opportunities, and I'll dive into some more depth and detail around the quality management system side here in a little bit. But you can see there's still a lot of challenges about integrating risk management approaches throughout our entire business. So really, really challenging thing that we are still faced with as an industry. Now, there are some intrinsic benefits to being able to integrate risk throughout your entire process. And again, all of this data that I'm sharing with you this is not John's opinion, this is not Greenlight's opinion, this is informed by the medical device community. These are all data that we got from the participants in the state of medical device industry from many medical device professionals. So you can see that there is an idea that, or an understanding that having a closed loop traceability, and I'll take a moment to talk a little bit about what that means here in a second, but that there is an understanding that this is really important with respect to risk. And what I mean by closed loop traceability is it's sort of a different way to think about the total product life cycle. I shared a few slides ago, one of the challenges is that feedback loop. When I launch a product and I learn things from customers and users and manufacturing, that one of the challenges that we're faced with is taking that information and feeding it back into the risk management process. So that's sort of a different way to think about closed loop traceability. Basically, I want to make sure that this is a control system, if you will, that I have these feedback channels going back into our risk management process, and then we follow the methodology that we have to hopefully define within our processes and procedures that align with 14971 about analyzing, evaluating, controlling, mitigating risk. So this is really important, this concept of closed loop traceability. A lot of companies, I was really encouraged, frankly, by this, that about 46% of the respondents said that they can actually demonstrate closed loop traceability, which is awesome, really. And I think we certainly have a room to improve. I hope the next time that Greenlight conducts this survey that we see that this is maybe skewing towards 75, 80%. So I encourage you all to help make that a reality, because it's really important that we're making medical devices. The medical devices that we're designing, developing, manufacturing, and selling are intended to help somebody in some way, shape, or form. You're trying to improve the quality of life. So having this closed loop traceability is really key to ensuring that those products that are on the market are safe and effective and continue to meet the use cases that we've defined. So let's talk a little bit about 14971, 2019. I know every time a new regulation changes or a standard is updated, which, as I'm sure you're well aware, over the past 4 or 5 years, it seems like every other month we're hearing about yet another standard change or a new regulation. We refer to that as a tsunami of changes in our world because it does seem constant. And I think that's a really important thing for us to embrace as medical device professionals. I'm an engineer by training, by education, and I can speak for how historically I've been and a lot of other engineers that I've worked with. Sometimes there's a high resistance to change, and change is, I can't remember who's actually gets credited with this, but we all know this saying, change is one of those constants in life that will always be changing. And I think that that's something that we as med device professionals need to start to embrace, especially as regulations get updated, as standards change, and so on. And it's really important as well because a lot of times the medical device industry can sometimes be maligned and make evening news or newspaper headlines. And usually when that happens, it's not for good things. It's usually because something bad happened. And I think, us embracing risk is really important so that hopefully the news stories, the headlines will be about how you and your company are making a difference in patients' lives. That's really what we're trying to do. That's why I'm in the medical device industry, is to improve the quality of life, is to have a positive impact on humanity. So, but the changes can be tricky because we start to to adapt our practices, our processes to align to a certain way, and it's like, oh, all of a sudden now this standard changes, and do I have to change something about that? Uh, I'm happy to report to you that with respect to 14971 and risk management, that by and large, the methodology, the approach is more or less very much the same. There's not huge dramatic system changes that will require you to overhaul your approach per se. Now, one caveat to that is even in 2020, I still see a lot of companies that struggle to align with 14971. I talked about FMEA a few moments ago. That is still, and don't mishear me, there is a point in time where FMEA is a very valuable tool, but it is not 14971. FMEA is failure modes effects analysis. It's a very bottom-up approach. It requires knowing a lot of depth and detail about the product. It implies that there was a failure condition, and it is a single fault failure that you're assessing and evaluating. If you understand and interpret 14971, it implies that you need to understand the sequence of events that have to transpire for a hazardous situation to occur. And the other thing is that it doesn't necessarily mean that there has to be a failure condition for risk to be present. I mean, I just want you to kind of wrap your head around this for a moment. A needle, for example, an intravascular needle, you can use that device exactly how it was designed, exactly how it's intended, and there's still risk. There was no failure condition, but there's still risk. And this is sort of the essence, if you will, of 14971, is you need to look at not just at the failure states and conditions, but also the normal use cases and understand the situations that could lead to potential harm, and understand and kind of wrap your head around that. But anyway, back to 14971 2019. A couple of updates. One of the, I don't want to say big one, but it's kind of sort of a label change. The instead of calling it a risk benefit analysis, it's now being referred to as benefit risk analysis. I guess that's good. Put the benefit in front of the risk. But there are some additional guidances that are defined within that standard as well. A couple annexes that are, they're pretty good. It gives you a little bit more depth and detail. There's also some additional information. Well, let me go to there's a corresponding guidance document. This is pretty recent as well, but the 24971 has a few more details around like cybersecurity and risk management file, and really this guidance document is really good information to help you better understand what is expected of you from a risk management standpoint. And at the same time, I mean, yeah, the standard is here to provide guidance and information, but if you just blindly, try to put a process in place to check boxes and make sure that you're meeting all the requirements, you're really missing the essence of what risk management is all about. And I want to give you some tips and pointers to use risk management as a positive practice rather than perceive it as a checkbox activity to satisfy compliance needs. Continuing on a little bit, the 2019 version of 14971 also has a little bit of impact in the EU. Again, risk management has been expected of us as med device professionals for a long, long time. But there's some additional, the whole Z annexes in the EU and the confusion that created a few years back. I think that's still a little bit fuzzy right now. I'm sure many of you are well aware of EU MDR and its implications and some of the challenges with timelines and that sort of thing. So we're still in a little bit of an uncertain state with respect to the EU MDR globally. But we do know that 14971 and specifically best in class risk management documentation and practices and behaviors should be ingrained with us as medical device professionals, and that we should be able to present information to regulators to corroborate and support our decisions that we're making with our medical devices. So I guess to give a little bit more context, let's dive in and make sure that we're, I guess, getting some convergence and some alignment around some of the key terms and philosophies and approaches from a risk management perspective. Again, these are not my definitions. These are not green light definitions. These are terms that are defined within the 14971 standard. And I'm not going to read all of these to you. You can certainly take a snapshot of the screen. There's also a handout that you can access with all the slides. You can go get the standard. You should have the standard, frankly, to see these things. But these terms are important because I think we should all be speaking or understand what we're talking about. A lot of times these terms get sort of misused, and is that a big deal? Not necessarily. I mean, a lot of times our spreadsheet or our approach to documenting risk can combine a lot of these activities or these terms all sort of in one mega spreadsheet, and but realize the terms do have some slight distinctions from one another. I think really more importantly, it's about the practice, it's about the behavior, it's about the intent that we're applying for risk with respect to our products. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, this defines what is expected to go into a risk management file. We should have a plan of what we're doing. We should analyze, we should evaluate, we should make sure that we're assessing those risks, and where needed as defined or as dictated by our acceptance criteria, we may need to implement some risk control measures. We may need to mitigate those risks. We need to assess the overall risk acceptability. We need to weigh in the benefits versus the risk of our product. We need to have some review of that, and then that closed loop traceability or that feedback, those production and post-production risk. We need to have a mechanism to handle that. Risk management can, if we allow it, can be a very complicated, convoluted approach. If you've ever spoke with me or interacted with me or heard me on a webinar or a podcast or any of those things, I try to make this as simple as possible. And what drove me to start Relay Guru back in 2013 was at that time I was doing a lot of work in spreadsheets, and I was working within different systems and processes that they seemed to be more complicated than it needed to be. And a lot of the things that I was doing, frankly, were it was just a lot of spreadsheet maintenance, and I was spending a lot of time doing what I felt were little to no value add activities. Like, who wants to spend a part of their day every day just updating a spreadsheet, merging cells and adding columns, and then making sure that that same term or phrase is used consistently throughout the same document? I've spent a lot of time doing that, and I found some of these things that some of the practices that I was working within were they made things way harder than they frankly needed to be. And I think risk management is one of those things. How many of you have sat in a risk assessment team session? Maybe you reserve a conference room for a day, and the goal of the activity is to go through the entire product and identify all the hazards and hazardous situation, and then start to assign severities and probabilities, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, if you've ever done that, I mean, it's mind-numbing, and you get to the tail end of that day that you reserve, hour 6 or hour 7, and it's interesting because when teams are in that environment, they start to acquiesce and yield and just say, let's just get this done. And if you've ever been in that situation, and I have in my career, it caused me to scratch my head a little bit and like, why are we doing this if it's just to check a box, if it's just to satisfy something? If I'm spending this much time doing something, I want to get value out of it, and I want to make sure that that value is incorporated into the product that I'm involved with, so that the patients at the end of the day can benefit from that value. So we've tried to boil the risk management ocean, if you will, into 10 very simple steps. I'll go through those a little bit, or in a little bit of depth, but really it's about just being methodical about this, starting this process early, not going through an exercise just to go through the exercise, but to make sure that what I'm doing at every step along the way is a risk-centered approach, or risk-based approach, or risk is that center of the universe. All of the things that I do are about making sure that the product that I'm going to introduce is safe and effective and meets those indications for use. Again, risk, not just risk, but also the design and development of a product. This is a total product lifecycle process. It starts with an idea, goes through some sort of design and development. I'm going to launch, I'm going to learn things post-market. Yeah, there might be a time where we want to obsolete a particular product, but this is cyclical. I'm always learning, I'm always evaluating, I'm always assessing, I'm always updating based on information that I have at that point in time. So I want to dive through the 10 steps, if you will, in a little bit more depth and detail. Step number one, it's all about planning. Again, I'm going to use some quotes, some old adages. I don't know who said all of these things, but these are a little cliche. But if you fail to plan, you plan to fail, and I think that's really important when you talk about risk. If you don't map out or plan your approach, your methodology, the steps, who's involved, when they need to be involved, et cetera, then it's a trivial activity. And granted, a lot of you probably already have risk management processes that are defined. That's great. That's one of those things that I think you should always kind of evaluate every, maybe it's part of your internal audit program, or maybe it's just, a opportunity for improvement every so often, maybe once a year, maybe a couple of times a year, but you should evaluate, are we getting value out of this process? Do we have too much fluff or too many steps that are just like checkbox activities? Do we not have enough stuff, enough fluff, if you will? But that process should always be fine-tuned for the greatest efficiency, but also the value that you and your colleagues can get from that, so that it really is about making sure that people are kind of reprogramming how they're thinking about risk. Within the plan for your product, it is really key to define roles and responsibilities. I think this is part and parcel with a project plan or a design and development plan. These are theoretically could be in the same sort of activity. Maybe you have criteria that requires these to be separate artifacts. Either way, it's sort of semantics. It's really up to you, but make sure it's clear what roles and responsibilities folks have with respect to risk. And it's really important to get that voice of user incorporated in this process as well. Whether you have actual users involved, clinicians, I think that's the best practice. That would be the best idea. I'm not implying that you invite the clinician in for an all-day risk management jam session, but understand their perspective and gather that intel and feedback. And you know what? It's going to integrate well with your design and development process anyway. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a few minutes. But all of your activities should be documented, of course. Of course, we know this as med device professionals. Though one of the mistakes I see with the risk management plan at times is that we document it one time and then we archive it. A plan should be dynamic and living. I mean, every phase or stage, or there might be an opportunity or a need to assess and reevaluate or update that plan. So keep that as a living thing, if you will, throughout your entire design and development, but also your product lifecycle. Yeah, we have a special webinar offer for those of you participating in today's session. You can get a free risk management plan template. Very easy. Go to the link that you see on screen, www.greenlight.guru /risk-webinar-offer, and it's free, so enjoy that. Again, I talked about sort of what led me, or a little bit about what led me to start Greenlight Guru. We've actually built, we're purpose built, we're med device industry specific. And part of that being med device industry specific is we understand all the criteria and the requirements of FDA 820, 1345, Part 11, EU MDR, also 14971, and we've built workflows that align with those requirements. Within the risk workflow, it aligns with all the expectations and criteria from a 14971 perspective. And our attempt and interest in doing so is to try to simplify the minutia and the things that trip a lot of people up, so that you can focus less on the workflow because it's already there, and focus more on the content and the information, and making sure that you're spending your time, your valuable time, on the right things, rather than just editing and updating and keeping a spreadsheet, where it needs to be. Well, you don't have to worry about all of that with the purpose-built solution from a Greenlight Guru perspective. And if you want a demo, it's very easy. Go to Greenlight, www.greenlight.guru. Just submit your information, and we'll get a hold of you, and we'll work with you on that demo, so you can see about what these workflows are all about. Continuing with the 10-step process. Yeah, technically, I guess steps 2, 3, 4, and 5 are sort of kind of different steps, if you will. But in practice, I think these can all they can all very much flow together. You need to understand, I think though, that the intended use is important, very important for a lot of reasons. It's certainly important from a regulatory perspective. How is FDA going to view or interpret or classify your product? That intended use is a key component to that. Same with other regulatory bodies, of course. I think it's important from a risk management perspective, because it really kind of defines the guardrails or the scope of your risk management activities for this particular product. Yeah, there are points in time where it is good to think about, misuse, either intentional misuse or unintentional misuse of your product, sort of outside the confines of the intended use scenario. That could be a little bit of a slippery slope. I'm not going to dive into the challenges with that specifically today, but the intended use is important to give your team involved with risk assessment activities the right context, the right frame about the activity. Hazards. Again, I would encourage you, these terms get very confusing. Hazards, hazardous situations, foreseeable sequence of events, risk analysis, risk assessment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Use the 14971 definitions as your dictionary, if you will, so that you can all align with a similar understanding of what these terms mean. But I think speaking the same language on risk is really important, because sometimes I've seen arguments happen where somebody was like, "Oh, this is a hazard," blah blah, blah, and like they get very vehement and agitated about it, and this other person like, "No, that's really a harm or a foreseeable event." So these terms, they matter so that you and your team can be the most effective that you possibly can. But a hazard is a potential source of harm. And the 14971 standard has an annex that lists potential hazards. It's not intended to be exhaustive. It's intended to be thought-provoking. I know other standards like I believe the IEC 60601 also has this. So consult information that exists, not so that you don't have to think, but so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. That's my advice to you. Once you start to identify, and I'm going to talk about this in a very linear way. It doesn't have to be so linear per se. It's about understanding the relationship of these details, or these different items, hazards, how they relate to hazardous situations, etc. Step number 4, hazardous situation. Understand what that is. A hazardous situation is when certain circumstances or events align, if you will, and the situation presents itself. In order for a hazardous situation to occur, there is a sequence or foreseeable sequence of events that has to transpire. It could be a single event, or it could be multiple events that lead to that particular hazardous situation. I talked about the intravascular needle example a little bit earlier. Think about, just the using that product to access a vein or an artery. Well, what are the sequence of event, and if that, poking or that needle stick is the harm, if you will, or the situation, the hazardous situation, what are the steps that one had to go through in order to do that? I'm being a little bit trite here, but you had to open the package, you had to take the needle protector out, you had to stick it in the arm. So there were several sequence of events that led to that potential hazardous situation where harm could have manifested. So map those out, understand those, and that can help you triage and mitigate and control risk if those are situations that are unacceptable and the risk outweigh those medical benefits. But once you start to define your hazards, your hazardous situation, your foreseeable sequence of events, then you can, and your harm that can result from that, then you're going to be able to start to estimate the risk. And this term is confusing to people. Risk, quote, risk. By definition, per 14971, risk is the combination of severity of potential harm and the probability of that harm occurring. That's probably the most misunderstood or misapplied or area of confusion that people have, the inconsistent use or understanding or interpretation or definition of risk. So definitely make sure that you're all speaking the same thing. When you talk about risk, that you understand it is the combination of severity of harm and the probability that that harm actually occurs. I'm sure many of you are, you're probably nodding your head like, yep, we got something very much like that. This is a risk acceptability matrix. On the y-axis is the probability of that harm. On the x-axis is the severity of that harm. Whether this is 3x3 or 4x4 or 5x5, I've even seen people, some companies have 10x10. My caution to the 10x10 is you'll spin your wheels and waste a lot of time arguing about whether or not something is an 8 or a 9 more than you'll realize. That might be too many choices. So for most products, 5x5 seems to cut the mustard just fine. But it's up to you. But the definitions of the different choices for probability, the definitions of the different choices for severity, that is up to you to define. I know a lot of people want to be spoon-fed this information, but you have to define this, and it has to be commensurate and specific to your product. There is no one-size-fits-all definition of probability. There is no one-size-fits-all definition of severity. Even within your own company, if you have multiple product families that all have sort of different indications for use and different purposes, you should have different risk acceptability matrices for each of those different product families because it's different. This matrix is specific to the risk of your product. Furthermore, and this is a highly debatable conversation or topic of conversation anyway, but and if you want some fun, sometime go to like a LinkedIn forum, a medical device industry LinkedIn forum, and start asking or searching for risk acceptability criteria and ALARP versus AFAP versus ALAP versus benefit risk and all these sorts of things. People get very passionate about this particular topic. Again, I'm encouraging you to keep this simple, as simple as you possibly can. Whether or not you have a green, this is good, thumbs up, good to go, and a orange or a yellow, and this is sort of intermediate, and a red, this is the no-go zone, or you just have a red and a green zone. It's sort of semantics. It's really preference. And I know that the 2012 version of EN 14971 really created a lot of FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and certainly confusion for the industry, because that particular standard said, oh, you have to reduce every risk as far as possible, and you have to have benefit risk, or at that time it was risk benefit for every single thing, and so on and so forth. And I don't, it's that's probably a whole different topic for a whole different webinar or a whole different conversation. And certainly if you have questions and you want to talk with me about that, send me a note and we can dive into those details. For today, I want you to at least understand, define your criteria for risk acceptability, and do that before you start to assess the risk. Make sure you have clear criteria and that there's alignment and agreement within your organization. I've talked about spreadsheets and linking these throughout, and I think one of the challenges that a lot of folks have is design and development or design control activities and risk activities. The way we document and connect these things is very disjointed. A lot of times from a design control traceability, we have our own spreadsheet that's separate from our risk management spreadsheet. I think it's really important to understand the ecosystem here. Like I said, I started in my career in the medical device industry in the 90s. 14971 was not a thing. At that point in time, design and development, design controls, just being a prudent engineer or a good engineer, the methodology was all about, I mean, design controls is all about risk management of your medical device. You understand, or you try to define, identify user needs, you define your certain design input requirements, you develop the product, you come up with design output specifications. You're verifying, you're proving that the product meets those requirements. You're proving through verification that you've designed the product correctly. I mean, that sounds like a risk activity, right? And then through design validation, you're proving that your product meets your user needs. In other words, you're from a valid design validation perspective, you're proving or demonstrating that you've designed the correct product. Also sounds a lot like risk. And I can't explain it, I don't understand it, but over time, there's been this whole spin out of, oh, we have to do this whole other risk management set of activities. And I won't get into all the details on that. Suffice it to say, though, that it is expected today. These are largely viewed as separate documents and reports, but as a practical application of this, these should be ingrained with one another. You should be making risk-based decisions during your design and development process. You should be starting or assessing the hazards, the situations, the events that lead to those situations, the possible harm and severity probability of those items as early as you possibly can. For those scenarios where that risk is not acceptable or you need to mitigate, well, then that needs to feed back into your design control practices to use that. So figure out a way to blend these. And this is one of the things that we've done from a Greenlight perspective is fully integrated design control and risk management workflows with design reviews so that it is one seamless process. So again, I already talked about the importance of intended use. I've already talked about risk management being a cycle. It's a very iterative cycle, especially early on. And again, to the point that I mentioned, design control and risk, the way I think about it is they're kind of two different sides of the same coin. They're just different lenses or views into the world of this particular product. So don't reinvent the wheel. Make sure that your practices from a design and development standpoint incorporate good practices from a risk management standpoint, and that these are feeding one another rather than separate, disparate activities. Risk control, going back to that risk acceptability criteria, this is really key so that as a guiding force, so to speak, that this gives you a good context to know when something needs to be mitigated and reduced further from a control perspective. Best way to control your risk is inherent within that design. The least effective way from a risk control perspective is through some sort of labeling. In fact, some regulatory agencies have even said we do not accept label information or a statement in your IFU, your instructions for use, as a legitimate risk control measure. It should be inherent within that product design. So where you can, where there are risks that you need to mitigate, do so with the product design. Don't just check a box to say, oh, well, we added this little label and should be good to go. That's the least effective control, quite frankly. Benefit risk, a few months ago, this was risk benefit. Again, that's sort of semantics. But the idea behind this is I need to, as a medical device professional, I need to truly understand this relationship between the benefits that my product provides with respect to the risk. And there are some, obvious cases where, if I'm developing something and there is no clinical solution for this particular modality or illness or whatever the case may be, in that scenario, and if the patient doesn't get my product, they have a certain chance for death. Not to be grim or dire here, but in that scenario, it's a little bit easier to corroborate that, oh, wow, if they don't have my product, then death is a certain outcome. My product provides a lot of benefit. Again, that's kind of an extreme example, but it is important to think about it through that lens, understanding, is your product going to create more risk or undue risk or unwarranted risk, or are there intrinsic benefits that we need to assess and evaluate? And this is a good point, or an area where you can involve the clinicians who will be involved with your product to have them, weigh in on this. All of this information is about documentation. My good friend Mike Drews, you probably, if you've listened to the Global Medical Device podcast, you've heard he and I talk about the topic of risk management a time or two. And I'm paraphrasing him a little bit here, but a lot of times we feel as though we're compelled to do certain things or required to do certain things because the regulations say so. And then we almost have like a fear of regulatory bodies. But as Mike says, if you have fear in this industry, the folks that you should fear are the litigation attorneys. And this whole notion of documenting risk management, there are a couple of edges to that sword. If you document too much, then and you didn't incorporate that into your product, then kind of damned if you do, so to speak. But this can be a treacherous thing or a tricky thing to navigate from a documentation standpoint. But if you have questions about how much is too much, how much is not enough, feel free to reach out, and happy to have a chat with you and explain or understand your product and what should be captured from a documentation and from a report standpoint. But it is an expectation that you are documenting your risk acceptability criteria. It is an expectation that you have had some review of that information within your risk management file. It is an expectation that key executives at your company are involved in that process. And that's all I'll say about that for right now. And then kind of that 10th step, if you will, in the risk management process is that closed loop component, and making sure that you have feedback into from things like internal audits, CAPAs, complaints, customer feedback, manufacturing non-conformances, so on and so forth. All of these things that you're going to learn about your product post-production and in production, that they're feeding back into this process, and that risk management file is living throughout the total product life cycle. So just a few more moments here, and we'll get into some questions. Risk management is not a checkbox activity. If you are doing risk as a checkbox because you feel like you have to, I don't know, I would encourage you to get value out of the process. I would encourage you to understand the benefits, the positives that a risk-based approach can bring to you, your team, your company. Please try to if it feels like a checkbox, then maybe it's time to reinvent or reevaluate or reassess your practices. Risk-based QMS, I told you to talk a little bit about that. Let me share a few concepts of that. I think the part that gets confusing to people is that they're reading 14971 and they're like, that's about product risk management, and 1345 says thou shalt have risk-based approach, refer to 14971. What is that all about? My understanding or my interpretation of that is 14971 describes or defines a risk methodology, a process, if you will, that yes, it is with the product lens, but the methodology that's described within that standard can be applied to other practices or other processes that you have. And the easiest example that I can think of is supplier management. And here's the secret: you probably had or might have already been doing a lot of these risk-based approaches before. You just might not have called them risk-based approaches. But from a supplier management perspective, uh, I should make sure that all of my suppliers are qualified, that they're evaluated. I probably have some sort of assessment or some sort of criteria where, maybe I identify this supplier as critical and this one is not critical. You probably have some definitions to your supplier. You shouldn't treat all suppliers equal with respect to your evaluation, qualification, and ongoing monitoring. The activities that you apply towards supplier management should be commensurate with the risk that that supplier poses to the quality of your product. Like if you are purchasing a critical component from a supplier that critical to the function and performance of your device, you probably should do something a little bit more qualification and ongoing monitoring and engagement with that supplier versus the company or the supplier that you're buying copy paper from. Different level of control. And I know that might be an oversimplistic example, but that's the sort of idea that is intended with having risk-based approaches in your quality management system. And keeping that all connected in an ecosystem, Greenlight has built total product lifecycle, an entire medical device QMS that is entirely connected and can help you incorporate closed loop traceability, pre-market, post-market, and all the different quality events, and keep all of these things connected. So again, if you're interested in that, I would encourage you to reach out to the folks at, or my colleagues at Greenlight Guru, www.greenlight.guru. Everything I talked to you about today about risk, about design controls, as well as an entire 1345, 820, EU MDR, Health Canada, MDSAP, all of those methodologies and workflows, they're all built into the workflows within a Greenlight perspective. So thank you all so much for taking time out of your busy days to participate into today's session. So Alex, I guess I'll throw it back to you to see if there might be some questions.
Yes, we do have a couple of questions here, but unfortunately we are approaching time here, so we will only have time to address a couple of these, unfortunately. So apologies to those that submitted questions. We may not get to all of these, but we will supply them to John after the program if he so chooses to follow up with these after the program. So in the interest of time, we'll get right on these. So the first question asks, what is your advice on the standard to use? The harmonized, let's see. Oh, I see there's a follow on from the previous question. So it says EN 14971 2019 is currently not harmonized. EN 14971 2012 is. What is your advice on the standard to use, the harmonized or the not yet harmonized, or both?
That's a great question. It's highly debatable. My advice is to move towards the 2019. Quite frankly, harmonizing standards is not a trivial activity. Especially with what's already going on with the EU, with the MDR. I've worked pretty closely with some of the folks that wrote the 14971 standard. And I've even heard some of them say that some of the clauses and criteria in the EN 2012 do not align with the EU MDR. I mean, I guess that's the big point here is align with the expectations of EU MDR. I believe following 14971 2019 will allow you to do so from a product risk management standpoint.
Alrighty, and I believe we have time for just one more this afternoon. Asking what are the differences between ISO 14971, excuse me, and EU ISO 14971?
Well, I mean, the date at the end will dictate if there are differences or not. Standards management and how regulatory bodies and other entities embrace these. Sometimes they'll put their own spin, or they'll add an annex, they'll add a guidance document. So the date at the end will be somewhat important. My suspicion is that in that specific example, there's probably little to no difference in that particular case.
Alrighty. So unfortunately, folks, we are at time, and to make sure that we respect everyone's schedules, I do want to disconnect at this time. We'll supply the rest of the questions to John after the program, but unfortunately, we are at the time. So thank you all for your time in attending today. I really appreciate it. After we disconnect today, there'll be a survey that is displayed here from GoTo. Just please take a moment, if you so choose, to leave a review for our program. That'll help us kind of build out future programs. So thank you once again, John, for your time. I really appreciate it. And please have a great rest of your day.